like to open this up to the floor for questions.
Thank you very much. Everyone on the panel. I wanted to ask a little more about what Tom said earlier, firstly, about the word dissident becoming quite cool, and perhaps that's happened in the past, it'll happen again, but it certainly happened around Occupy, and also Elena's idea about the kind of idealization of dissent in that sense. I was just wondering if the panel would comment on, I mean, the positive things about that, in that arguably it has made the British public and the American public a lot more aware of some of these issues, but also the negative points that Elena alluded to.
Yeah, I would say that I was probably being a little bit facetious by saying, being a dissident is cool, because, I don't see myself as one. I think it might be seen as being something to aspire to, just because of the history and Che Guevara and people wearing T-shirts and all the rest of it. But I wouldn't say that I see myself as one. I'm just doing what I feel is the right thing, and making a little contribution myself, and writing a book and doing what I do. So I think that it's interesting. There was a tweet up there, asking a similar question, and if you tweeted that from there, but all right. And yeah, there is this thing about is it fashionable? I don't actually see protest as fashionable. If it was fashionable, I would hope there'd be more people doing it, but there aren't. And we're a sort of small band of brothers that did what we did and are doing what we do, but we don't see people joining us who are sort of thinking, hey, I want to be part of the gang. My answer would be, I actually wish it became a cool thing to do, but not in a sort of, how I look cool, fashion cool, but you know what I'm talking about, in terms of, actually, I did a talk at the oratory school about 6 weeks, and there were some interesting questions that were asked by some of these kids, some of whom are very switched on. Equally, there were some kids there that clearly, feel as if we shouldn't be there, or feel threatened, or this, that, and the other, or felt that it's much more important to think about other things and not address some of these issues. Yeah, I wish it just becomes more cool to take these questions on.
Could I just make an interesting distinction? One thing about dissent in Eastern Europe in the past was it's about personalities, figures like Havel or Wałęsa or Michnik, whoever it was. And in fact, Havel even says to be a dissident, you have to be known in the West, right? And we still see that in China. Figures like Ai Weiwei or Liu Zhibao and so on. They're these towering figures. What's interesting thing about Occupy is it's anonymous. Right? I mean, with respect to Tom, it doesn't have these big figures. It's the 99%. It's about the anonymous masks, and I think that's very interesting. It says there's some different dynamic, some different social dynamic, that it's not about these big, Sakharov moral individuals, but it's about the 99%. I think that's one interesting dynamic, which is probably linked to the question of technology, which we might want to discuss more.
The fundamental is totalitarianism. And democracies are so fundamentally different. I mean, you can be a dissident in China today, or Iran, or Cuba, wherever it may be, and you have to be very, very careful. So when Liu Zhibao kicked off Charter 08, he took a big risk, and in fact, the penalty was to go to prison. And he's not well known in China, and I was speaking yesterday to somebody, the person who actually received his Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years ago. There's a Chinese who was at Tiananmen Square, was in prison, and managed to get out to the United States, and now works with dissidents. And he said that the problem for Liu Zhibao and other intellectuals is that they're vilified by the state media and by the regime in China, and they're not known by and large to people. The uniqueness about Ai Weiwei is he is an immensely popular person, because he not only has talked about the situation in China in general terms, but has picked up things like the baby milk scandal and the appalling earthquake which killed thousands of school children, and he's made himself into something different. So he is a popular figure, and he is trendy. But the difference between, as I said, dictatorship and a democracy is people like Tom are known to their own people and to, I hope, a wider public with his book and this slightly imperfect pamphlet. But he can be trendy because it's a democracy.
I mean, I think there are a number of different layers there. I mean, one might be the idea of, as you were saying, trendy, that almost can function as sort of advertisement, or making these issues more attractive and thus more interesting to people. There might be then a more negative idea of, fashionable, where it really becomes a sort of degraded form of this. But this does seem to me like it comes back to what we were talking about before, the idea that dissidence, well, you put that word in quotation marks, but it's a lifestyle in some way. It's not a choice you make. It's something that you do because you don't see any other way of living. And for that reason, it's more than simply a set of political goals. It does become more of something that structures various aspects of your life. There might be something that's underlying here. Do we have more questions?
Thank you. I want to just follow up that last comment, because it seems to me that it's increasingly the case in prosperous, stable, relatively democratic Western societies that there's such pressure on most people not to dissent in a way that would materially affect their security, their career, their pension, their health, their relatives' health. I mean, all the sort of things that worry everybody every day. And I'm interested to know whether you, as a panel, see an interesting, like an obverse to the attraction of dissent through either crisis or through moral objection. Is there a lot of the time, many people who are not in crisis and who are sort of lulled into a sense of tolerance of all sorts of appalling things that governments do or don't do?
Yes, is the answer. I mean, let's just start there. There isn't anybody in Occupy that is in Occupy because it's trendy. That's the first thing. Second thing is that in terms of what it does for your job prospects, and it's not career enhancing, I wouldn't say. It has to be said that there's a few people that have come up to me when I've been doing outreach, and every now and then someone will say, well, you're doing because you've got nothing better to do. I'm just saying, trust me. I've got other things I could be doing. I'm doing it because I feel a sense of injustice and I want to change things, and that's why we're here, and we're going to do it. So, it really isn't about it being trendy. Yes, it's absolutely true that there are mechanisms in place that make this more difficult. Not least, to be honest, on the occasions when we have been on a march, or we have been protesting, or we sat down outside the Bank of England on March the 12th and had a discussion. We at 5 o'clock we were threatened with arrest unless we left, on the basis that there was the police officer in charge decided that there might be a threat of breaching the peace at some point later on. Not that we were actually at the time. That case was thrown out 6 weeks later after they arrested 5 of my colleagues. So yes, there's a subtle and not very loud disincentive to protest. Not least, the sort of because of the potential implications on your future, particularly in times when, like this, it's difficult enough getting a job, let alone if you turn up and someone said, oh, weren't you one of those ones?
There seems to be different opinions in the panel as to the role of politics in dissent. So we've got two parts to my question. The first one is, do, in your opinions, you have to have an overtly political goal for dissent to be effective and pragmatic, as it were, as we see in the Arab Spring and protests in China? And can you, in fact, dissent, is it possible, without being political in some sort of way?
Personally, I'm very against this notion that rules dissent as something moral and out of politics. I mean, Havel talked about his own political practice as anti-politics, but in fact it was what was fundamentally political in the Greek sense of the word, which is emerging from one's oikos, from one's home, and entering the city, the polis, from which we get the word political. That's what politics is taking public space, whether tent camps, right, or not. But that's what it was actually taking over the public sphere, and I think that's what dissent does. It draws people together out of their private alienated concerns, and it says, no, we are part of politics. I think it's fundamentally political in the sense that, you know, Hannah Arendt, for example, talks about the essence of politics, yeah, coming together in a space of appearance in the polis. Yeah, that anti-politics is extremely political. What I think dissent is doing personally is reinventing politics, or giving back to politics its real meaning that is lost in, yes, the electoral democracy and democratic deficits and so on. I think that's properly what dissent is. I mean, they had elections and they had politics in Czechoslovakia, right? But that had become completely, under socialism, but that had become completely, petrified and formal and meaningless. And what dissent was reinventing politics and giving it a new meaning. So for all it being anti-political or moral, I think actually it's necessarily political, or political. Yeah? Sorry, horrible phrase, or political. My students will quote me on that. But anyway, Aliona, but you had a slightly different view, or no?
No, not really. I think what you brought up just now was quite interesting. That is the division between the public and private, between the home and the city. And when we talk about morality, you know, it's something that is centered at home, or, you know, it's individual based. And when we talk about standards, you know, that are imposed to us, you know, rules, some norms that are common in society, it's something that we share publicly. It's something that we all engage in rule following, and we are all able to go on according to that mode. And that's a Wittgensteinian ways of understanding rule following. You know, if you're able to go on into the situation, you don't need to explicate those rules. You just get on with it. And I think what's interesting about the Occupy movement, that at some point they feel they cannot go on. They are not capable to follow the rules that are offered to them. And therefore, they are pressed in a situation where they start challenging and testing the boundaries of the system. And guess what? The system is dependent on it. It's dependent on you being there for it, to rebalance and to readjust. And I think it's really essential that that kind of symbiosis is kept in mind. And thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, what I would say on that is, first of all, you know, if we talk about political goals, first and foremost, it's for government to actually do what they're meant to be doing in terms of representing most people, which it appears that they increasingly don't. So that's got to be one of the first things. And secondly, I would say that absolutely. I mean, the fact is that a lot of people come together October last year with this shared sense of injustice with the system and with what happened in the banking crisis. And there's a very good reason for that, because some of the things that we're talking about, no politician's talking about it. And we're here to start putting pressure on them so they do start talking about it. And if they don't start talking about it, we're obviously going to spread the word as a people's movement and hopefully lead to some sort of political pressure so that they are talking about it.
I just wonder if we could ask the speaker his view.
Yeah.
You seem to have an opinion.
Well, most definitely. I agree with what you originally said in that, because dissent is with regards to the whole system as itself. You can't question the system or move against the system in any way without becoming political and looking to involve other people in that sense. But I doubt everybody else wants to hear from me, and I'll turn back over to you guys.
Well, the public space now is of a different thing than it was in the time of the people we've been talking about this evening, the last, let's say, since Gomez, the last war. The media like this, Twitter, or its equivalent in China, because I think Twitter is not available in China, nor is Facebook, nor is Google. So they've created their own parallel systems, but nevertheless there's a political space which is opened up. But to come back to your point, if you define politics as something political, no. I think, for example, in the Arab Spring, young people wanted the restoration of what they saw as human dignity. It's as basic as that, because they thought it had been stolen from them by the state, as happened in all those dictatorships across the Arab world. So it's not in itself party political, or in any sense political in the way we might think about Tory Lib Dem Labour. It's much wider perspective, and the space they occupy, the sort of democratic process you describe as politics, is this new dimension of mass movement, of using the social media, of handing out leaflets as they did on the 25th of January and around Tahrir Square. They went to the shops and handed out bits of paper saying, come to the square. So it wasn't just Twitter.
I think we have time for one more question.
I want to go on local issues. In UK, around about over 1 million British citizens from Kashmiri heritage. So what we know about their issues, and round about more than 200,000 living in EU as well. And in media, they actually labeled as homegrown or radicalized or homegrown terrorists. So how we can bring them in, why they excluded?
I represent Yorkshire and the Humber in the European Parliament, and I have very good relationships with the enormous number of Kashmiris who live there. And I recognise the problems that you have on both sides of the valley, but I'm not sure it has a specific relationship to this topic. And your continued and happy existence in this country is very much to be welcomed. But as I say, I'm not quite sure what your point is in relation to this topic.
We're talking about big issues, and if we're talking about the humanity and we're talking about like Chinese or Arab Spring, so we can talk about the breadfruit spring as well, you know what I mean. So again, they are 4th and 5th generation, and they're living in this country, but again...
to come to your point, I mean, one of the problems is it's not about the United Kingdom, it's about you finding a voice within the Kashmir territories or India or Pakistan, not here. And I think the anguish you find, because as you say, 4th or 5th generation are now living here, is there's no way of resolving those questions other than through the United Nations or the great powers acting. But it's not, I'm afraid, something the UK can do much about.
I guess one feature of dissent is that no questions are not on the table, right? Everything can be asked. So, but perhaps we can have time for one more before we wrap things up. And I believe that Björn, that there's some reception to which we're invited, so we can carry on discussions where nothing is forbidden afterwards. Who was first? Shall we collect them?
Yeah. Okay. Well, mine might be a bit frivolous, actually. I think powerful systems and powerful people are seen as humorless, which I think is probably correct. Would the art of the impossible be to inject humour into dissidents? We have this feeling that, it's grim Oop North and trade unions and all that sort of thing. You lot outside the stock exchange. Oh, you weren't a barrel of laughs, were you? And I do think that humour can so deflect things, but I can't imagine that Putin's got, that he's a barrel of laughs. Anyway, thank you.
So humour, yeah?
Humour, yeah.
Pussy Riot as humour, yeah?
You mentioned earlier you were going to talk about the anti-austerity in Southern Europe, and my question involves what happens when dissent can reach extreme forms of radicalism, as it happens in several states, particularly I have in mind Greece. That's the question.
When we're talking about human rights and freedom of speech, we generally focus in Asian countries or Middle East countries or African countries. Is the panel aware, and particularly you, Mr. Vice President, dear Erdogan, of violation of human rights within the EU? I give you some examples. In my country, in Greece, Muslim minority for decades were oppressed systematically by the Greek governments. After the intervention of EU, today they are full citizens as everybody else. I'm sure you are aware that the French government oppresses systematically the Gypsy minorities in France. Is the European Parliament or EU in general thinking of doing something, or we are very selective for outside Europe human rights? Thank you very much.
Humor, the idea of extremism, and one might even think about sort of radical right-wing movements. Is that a form of dissidence of some sort? Disturbing question. And the idea of extreme violation of rights within the EU.
Should we parcel them up? Maybe, I'm afraid, Edward, you might have the last one. Do you
Can I
want
deal with,
humour?
well,
Do you
humour,
want
of course.
extreme forms of right-wing radicalism? You'd rather have humour. Okay. So,
Oh, right, okay.
so which shall we start with? Extreme
Could
forms.
we both have humor?
You both
Sure.
have humour?
Okay.
And on a positive note.
Sorry, you're absolutely right. Although it's interesting because we were painted as a pretty miserable lot when we were outside the exchange. We were all drug addicts. We were all homeless. We were all drunk. We were all defecating on the steps and walls. We're not actually that. We're actually quite a fun bunch. And we have actually some great talent, some great poets who do that. So yes, you're absolutely right, and we'll get them out next time.
Humour was very important in '89 in Poland. Orange Alternative was a parody of communism that the regime didn't know whether to take seriously or not, right? It was saying, we love Marx. They were slogans like that, and nobody knew whether it was a joke or not. And in that ambiguity came dissent, ambiguity of the sort that Aliona was talking about. Aliona, humour?
Yeah, I would just want to add that political anecdote is a terrific expression of humor, and the more totalitarian is the system and the more extreme is the constraint, the more it creates political humor. And we know, for example, that there is an enormous revival of political anecdote under Putin, although it almost disappeared, in the 1990s under Yeltsin. So there is this kind of whole sort of special issue on totalitarian laughter, and how you laugh in a different way under oppressive regimes. And of course I've got my very own idea of a knowing smile, which is not quite about humor, but it's about ambiguity and more subtle way of communicating that we know what we are talking about, but we are going only partially expose it and send each other a signal that we could read between the lines, but not actually articulate it loudly for the outsiders. And that kind of system of ambiguous play is really essential for the reproduction of those systems, that is a context for the dissent.
Can I just deal with that point? But just by way of prefacing my remarks, someone's tweeted on the hashtag Sakharov debate that the Arab Spring happened despite the EU. And if I ever said that, I would never repeat it, but it is not true. The Arab Spring happened because, as I said at the beginning, the people were aspiring to human values. And that is what it's about. The EU does have a structure of promoting human rights, democracy, the rule of law, fundamental freedoms, and a free media around the world. And it does it very effectively, and I'm pleased it does it. And part of that process is to have this annual Sakharov Prize to celebrate people of great distinction, dead or alive, who have expressed themselves in a way which is remarkable. And that's why we're celebrating that next week and have celebrated so many in the past. The second point, to come back to your point about within the EU, there are new provisions under the Lisbon Treaty which allow the EU to act in the field of human rights, whether infringements, whether they're immigrants coming in from North Africa and not being properly treated by the French authorities. There are a whole range of mechanisms available. It's not just the political message. The fact is you do have new rights as EU citizens within the EU too. So we should all celebrate those two words and everything that goes with it.
Just on the other question, which is a very important one, I mean, perhaps the role of violence is important. Golden Dawn are dissenting, but they're using it through violence, and the tradition of dissent is non-violent. EDL, the London riots, is that dissent. Perhaps one could say, violence is a sort of cut-off line, but it's a very, very important thing.